Let's go, baby. What's going on? Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Getting set up here. We're going to be talking about some boxing history. In particular, we're going to be talking the great John L. Sullivan, the Boston Strong Boy, John L. Sullivan. So I decided, just want to come on here and talk a little bit about the history of the sport. In particular, the first world heavyweight champion in the sport of boxing, John L. Sullivan, the Boston Strong Boy, of course. And what a better time than now? I want to test out something new. This seemed optimal. I know we have people who support the channel, who like the history, and we discuss it. We do so on Sundays, and it's typically the modern stuff, but we'll mix in a little bit of history here and there. But we wanted to give this a go here today, or at least I wanted to do it. Shout out to the Boz, man. Jumped in and said, let's go, champ. Appreciate you being here without a doubt. Again, we're talking boxing history. In particular, we're talking John L. Sullivan. Coming into this, I was thinking to myself, how do I want to go about this? Do I want to script this? Do I want to have something laid out? I figured, you know what? I've done some stuff on him, and I should just go off top. I don't know everything about John L. Sullivan. I know some stuff here and there. Kind of followed his career since the jump and read up on the history of him, and I feel good about it. So came to give it a shot just to talk about the great John L. So again, known to be the first world heavyweight champion in the sport of boxing, and that is under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. And there's a misconception as far as John L. Sullivan and his career. Essentially, many feel that, or many associate him with the bare-knuckle era. And while he did fight bare-knuckle, the majority of his fights in his career overall were actually gloved fights. He was actually against bare knuckle fighting, and hence this came right around the time that the Marquess of Queensberry rules were truly starting to take off. This is the 16th Marquess of Queensberry. His name escapes me. Again, I'm doing this off top. But this is what kind of pushed John L. Sullivan in a trajectory towards gloved fighting. Not to mention, not to mention, it was illegal, of course, in many states, pretty much the majority overall. And as far as the U.S., it was illegal across the board as far as actual bare knuckle fighting and fighting in general. Boxing had a real bad stain and taste to it. It was considered to be a degenerate sport, and many didn't support it. So those that did were usually in the seediest of locations, the back rooms, the barges, all of the unforeseen spots, the alleyways, etc., the dark spots that you would associate with some of the sort of lowly things that take place in boxing fell along that category for the most part. Bosman says, I also don't know too much about him. Can't wait to find out more. Yeah. Certainly, Boz. Yeah, appreciate you once again. But yeah, so Sullivan, he came to during this era where we're actually transitioning. Essentially, you had bare knuckle and you had London prize ring rules, which were essentially the same thing, but the rule sets varied slightly. And when you really think of bare knuckle, you can take that back to some of the great fighters who were competing well before gloves were even a thing, and that was the likes of Tom Cribb, Tom Malinew. It goes back beyond that, really. Bill Richmond. You think about guys like Mendoza. Mendoza's first name is escaping me at the moment, but he's another one. But essentially, John L. Sullivan, he came to right as that shift started to come about. And I'm going to be answering questions along the way, so feel free to drop them in if you if you have any questions. Could definitely answer those. So a Facebook user said, did he avoid Jack Johnson? No, he did not avoid Jack Johnson because their paths wouldn't have crossed in all likelihood because of the fact that John L. Sullivan's last fight took place in 1892, and that was his loss to James J. Corbett. And that was his only loss of his career. And Jack Johnson, he started, is reported as early as 1894. Now, had John L. Sullivan been the type of fighter who took care of himself and had a long career, which we're accustomed to seeing with fighters or historic fighters over the years, then that potential may have come about. It would all have depended on whether John L. Sullivan fought a fighter of color, which he did not. But in theory, the potential could have been there for that. That being said, John L. Sullivan would have been up there in age had that been the case. When he last fought, he was 32 years old, and that was 1892. So Johnson's first fight, at least what is being reported, was 1894, sometime around there. So Sullivan could have been around 34 or whatever, 34, 35, depending on the time frame. And Jack Johnson, of course, we know what he went on to become, but in all likelihood, even if Sullivan was willing to take on any and all challengers at that particular time, in all likelihood, Jack Johnson wouldn't have been one of those foes, given that he was pretty much early in his career in 1894. I can't remember if he had more than one fight in 1894. I do recall, I think, one of mention. And then from there, he really came to in the 18 in the later part of the 1890s as well as the early 1900s. And of course, he became champion in 1908, and he was 30 at that particular time. So yeah, I don't think Sullivan and he would have crossed paths, but there were certainly some fighters that Sullivan could have fought during that particular time that we didn't get to see, which we'll touch on, of course. Uh, Bosman said he was 5'9", 5'10", strong guy, obviously. Yes, he's listed at 5'10". You see some sources 5'10 and a half, somewhere in there around there. And he was a sort of thick guy, He wasn't this Adonis, this chiseled person, but he did have a pretty strong neck, thick chest, uh, broad shoulders for his size. So he was put together well for his size, and especially during that time, we weren't really accustomed to seeing larger heavyweights. Now, of course, in every era, there are always large heavyweights. That being said, uh, seeing them at the elite level, then seeing larger heavyweights at the elite level, that wasn't something that we were necessarily accustomed to during the time that John L. Sullivan came to. So uh, his size being around 5'10" and a half, as mentioned, that was pretty formidable for his time, and given where the sport was at that particular stage. And you have to think this was early on. You as mentioned, or what I was speaking on earlier, you had some fighters shifting from the bare knuckle world to fighting under the Marquess of Queensberry. Uh, Bare knuckle, London prize ring rules. So a lot of things that were allowed under those rules wasn't allowed under Marquess of Queensberry, like the holding, throwing, wearing the spiked shoes, etc. So you could get away with a lot more during those days. Of course, in the way they operated, like knockdown would be considered the end of the round. They would go back to their corners for about 30 seconds, and then they come back out next round. That's why you had some fights during prior to the Marquess of Queensberry that were long, drawn out fights because there are a number of things that dictated such. And you could essentially stay away and avoid a fighter or avoid the fight in itself for long periods and not be penalized for such from a timing standpoint. So you could have one round that is like 30 minutes out of 8 rounds, for instance. It's just one of those sort of nuances that is tied to it. Really quick shout out to Random Acoustic Dots. Says big up 86. Appreciate you, Random. Just here talking some John L. Sullivan. Feel free to come through anytime. You know, it's always good talking to history with your buddy. We're talking John L. Sullivan here. Appreciate you dropping by. Be sure to check out Random Acoustic Thoughts, putting in that work over there. A lot of good information on the great Sam Langford we discuss all the time. As a matter of fact, we're going to be doing we're going to be finishing up the series on Jack Johnson versus Sam Langford and the rivalry that essentially could have been. They did fight once, but it could have been something bigger than what it ultimately was. Shout out to Hyphy. Hyphy, appreciate you being in here, bro. It says, teach me some history this evening. You know what? I'm going to speak a little bit on what I know just here in general. Try to see what comes about, but I appreciate you dropping in, Hyphy, as always. Always good to chat with you. Have this dialogue. Good stuff indeed. So appreciate everyone who dropped in, who's in now, and who will ultimately listen to the replay. So as mentioned, we're talking John L. Sullivan. I'm just going off of what I know from reading up on him, studying him over the last several years and everything. So this is all off top, you know what I'm saying? So anyway, where I was at was the size, because I had got the question from Boz in relation to his size. So yeah, he was formidable for his time as far as size. And I was saying that you saw the shift from the bare knuckle fighting where you could do a lot of different things and you couldn't do those same things under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. But the Marquess of Queensberry rules was being more accepted because you could essentially have these boxing exhibitions, and essentially we have exhibitions today, but these fights that were disguised as exhibitions. Now, generally, you couldn't knock your opponent out. If it got rough and tumble and you were essentially knocking your opponent out, then that could put you in legal trouble. But of course, there's always ways in which you can get someone to turn the blind eye, regardless of whether they're law enforcement or whomever in charge of whatever jurisdiction. There are ways in which you can turn the blind eye for sure. So, but John L. Sullivan, as mentioned, he was a proponent for gloved fighting because of the legal complications that came with fighting bare knuckle. Now, you can't tell the story of John L. Sullivan without talking about his fights that were bare knuckle fights, essentially, because of the fact that prior to him becoming what is considered the first world heavyweight champion of glove boxing, in order for him to get that distinction, he had to actually go through the bare knuckle world and take on the individuals that were considered the champions in that regard. And, you know, I've had some arguments with a person on the channel in the comments in relation to how sort of claims to certain titles and things of that nature came about. But essentially, it was like this. So for John L. Sullivan, when he started out, which was in the late 1870s, at that time, or as time went on, once we got to the point of the early 1880s, the person who was considered to be the top dog of the heavyweight division at that time was Paddy Ryan. And if you check the page, there's a video recently done on Paddy Ryan. It's not too long. I want to say it's probably around 6 minutes or somewhere in that nature. But he didn't have that video focuses on his boxing career, which wasn't super extensive because he spent the bulk of his time in making his name in the bare knuckle world. But Paddy Ryan was a guy who was like Sullivan for that time, a big, strong guy. Not huge in the sense of thinking about guys we're accustomed to seeing today, like the Anthony Joshua's, Tyson Fury's, but he's around similar size as Sullivan overall. But he had made his name in the bare knuckle world, and that's how he became a prominent player at that particular time. Now, with Paddy Ryan, he had backing, and that backing at one point was essentially the National Police Gazette. There was this guy by the name of Richard Kyle Fox who ultimately worked for the actual National Police Gazette. Then he worked out a deal to where he could actually purchase it, and he became the owner, editor, head in charge, the man essentially. And from that point, or during those particular times, not unlike how it is now in some facets, media was the main driver for how a champion was determined or how a name got out there. Of course, it wasn't just out of the blue. This had to be mentioned in some facets, some of it word to mouth, etc., etc. But Patty Ryan ended up having the backing of the National Police Gazette. So they were willing to put money on and behind him to take on whatever challenger. So as John L. Sullivan was coming up the ranks, he was making noise, and people were considering him to be that next guy. The only way that he was going to be able to overcome or jump over that hump of being considered the actual guy was by virtue of him taking on who was considered to be the man at that particular time, and it was Patty Ryan. And the thing about Patty Ryan, of course, as mentioned, is he built his name in the world of bare knuckle fighting. So, in order for John L. Sullivan to essentially secure that claim, he had to fight Patty Ryan with bare knuckles. And that's ultimately what happened in 1882. The two faced off, and it turned out to be essentially a no contest for uh, not no contest in the official sense of how you can have a boxing no contest in the sense that Patty Ryan wasn't much of a challenge at that particular time for John L. Sullivan. And John L. Sullivan ended up defeating Patty Ryan. I think his corner threw in the sponge after the third round. I want to say somewhere around there. I want to say it went around 7 minutes or somewhere in that neighborhood. Again, this is just me thinking about it based on what I recall. Now, either way, it ended up being John L. Sullivan who came out on top in that fight. Now, Patty Ryan was dealing with some type of a stomach issue prior to that. So it was mentioned that when he came into the fight, actually, he looked a bit pale and might not have been 100% up to snuff. But it didn't matter. Those times, the conditions were pretty much tough and rough for anyone who was competing, especially when you compare it to today. Not only just the conditions they were dealing with in general, but just this wasn't boxing. This wasn't boxing as we know it. So you didn't get the same things or weren't afforded the same things that we see today, where you have ringside doctors who have all of these different things that are ready there to service your every need. You have people taking care of everything for you as you're leading up to getting ready to get to the point of the fight. Very different than, this was, as mentioned, a very rugged sport, and especially considering it from the bare knuckle world, these typically had to take place in seedy places. So this fight, this fight was one of those that ended up being like that, and um, the two ended up competing as mentioned, and John L. Sullivan came out on top. That being said, this wasn't it for John L. Sullivan because he ultimately still needed to prove himself thereafter, because even with the win, he didn't necessarily gain the backing of the National Police Gazette. And I think this fight went down in Mississippi, Mississippi City, Mississippi, as a matter of fact. And thinking about it, there's some sketches or picture-like sketches out there of such. But anyway, so John L. Sullivan, he continued on from there, and he said at that particular time that he was no longer going to fight with bare knuckles because when this fight occurred, the governor of Mississippi at the time was actually this guy by the name of I know his last name is Lowry. I can't think of his first name for some reason right now. But Governor Lowry is what we're going to call him because his last name was Lowry. So Governor Lowry, he had got wind of such, and he didn't want the fight to actually take place in Mississippi. And so he was very much pissed once he found out that the fight actually took place. And he ordered the arrest of both of those guys, and it's essentially because they came on his turf and actually took place in this fight despite warnings not to do so. Hey, I'm just seeing some of the things pop in. They were kind of late in the mix here. Boz says, "Hey guys, good to see you here." Bosman also says Sullivan would probably be an MMA fighter today. Hey, he may very well have been. He may very well have been, but I think because of the fact that he had a thing for glove boxing, he might have still went towards the actual glove boxing angle. Dan L, thanks for dropping in. Dan L, who said London Prize rules made for some long rounds, but also a lot of short ones when a fighter got in trouble because all he had to do was hit the turf and end the round and get another rest period. That is true. That is a great point there that Dan L mentioned. Yeah, you could go down like that. As a matter of fact, one of Sullivan's rivals at the time, a guy by the name of Charlie Mitchell, and I know we have a video of Charlie Mitchell on the page, but he was really a middleweight, probably weighed anywhere between 150 and 160, probably at his best. He was a solidly built middleweight, but he gave Sullivan the most trouble out of anyone outside of James Corbett in that final fight of Sullivan's career. And this was primarily because Mitchell was one of those guys who was elusive, and he chose to not just fight Sullivan head on, and he chose to do things sort of as Daniel mentioned here, where he would hit the deck during a round, and he would avoid Sullivan and have Sullivan essentially chasing him the entire time, trying to land something. And that frustrated Sullivan, and he would lose his composure, lose his edge a bit. And as a matter of fact, I believe it was Charlie Mitchell who was the first to draw with Sullivan, and they had a fight in France, and something of this nature happened. It ended up being in the rain, everything, and it got to a point where frustration set in, and agreement was made to just end the fight as a draw during that particular time. But yeah, great point there, Dan L. Shout out to Vinny66. Appreciate you dropping in, Vinny. It's always good. I always love having the discussions. Thank you for dropping by, Vinny. Great stuff. Vinny says boxing in Sullivan's times were more like MMA before the Queensberry rule. They fought crazy amounts of rounds, but a throw which was legal was counted as a round, and it was not determined by time. True stuff. As mentioned, you did have those situations where, of course, you could toss a fighter to the ground. And that was very much legal. You had situations where fighters were being spiked because the shoes or boots or whatever they had on, they had spikes or almost like cleats, I guess is a kind of similar reference for today, because of the fact that these were usually on the ground, not necessarily in a actual ring. We were on good old fashioned dirt on the ground. It could be muddy, whatever, and you could have these spiked shoes in order to gain footing. But some fighters would actually use them, and there are stories, even with some of the fighters on the page that we've covered, where they suffered damage because of the fact that their opponent used these spikes on their shoes in the actual contest. I mean, you would have people hitting individuals while they were down, kicking them, etc. It was very much rugged. It was sort of like MMA, as mentioned, MMA with less rules, I guess you can say, overall, because it did get pretty crazy for some of those fighters. But yeah, a round, as mentioned, it could go on forever, and you could essentially run around and avoid an opponent. And if you didn't go down or weren't throwing many shots, as mentioned, it could last for a long period of time. So you could have a fight that in theory, that was 10 rounds, but 9 of those rounds could have only been 1 minute, and the other ones could have been an hour. You could have had a single round that was an hour, things of that nature. As crazy as it sounds, but it's very much the truth of how it was at that particular time. Bosman says early in the 20th century, you could not knock out a guy. It was against the rules. Yeah, there were things. It varied certainly from state to state. Just boxing rules, much like today, it's varied. Though a lot of things are similar today, but back then, of course, some states they had rules where you couldn't knock an opponent out, and They had some, and then there were some where there were rules where a fight had to be called a draw if an opponent wasn't knocked out. So when you think about seeing a bunch of draws on the records of a lot of the fighters from back in the day, that's one of the reasons there. You could have a fighter who, in theory, beat another fighter for 15 rounds straight, landing everything, hitting with everything but the kitchen sink. And that fighter could have left with both thighs bloody, swollen, uh, his lip missing. But if he didn't knock him out, then ultimately it was ruled a draw. So you'll have those type of disparities. That's why it's so different, especially when trying to compare today to fighters back then. Certainly not a one for one because there's so many things that have to be factored in. And when you see a lot of these draws on the records of these individuals, you can't just look at it straight up in a similar fashion to how we see a draw today, where we may have had the judges be the resulting factor in that becoming a draw. You had some of that back then. In some cases, you may have only had a referee who was the single judge in jurisdiction for a fight, and he could have called something a draw just because he liked the aggressiveness of another fighter, even if it wasn't effective aggressiveness. He could just call it a draw because he had the ability to do so. And you saw that in some fights. So, for instance, Jack Johnson, he has a loss on his record to Marvin Hart. Marvin Hart, of course, was the world heavyweight champion. He's not really touted as someone who was one of the top champions as far as champions who ended up winning the world heavyweight title. He is on that list of probably the worst. If we were to do a list of the worst world heavyweight champions, Marvin Hart would fall on that list, and he didn't have it too long. But essentially, he beat Jack Johnson, or at least he was given the victory over Jack Johnson in a fight where he was just aggressive the entire time, but really wasn't landing. Johnson was the more clever boxer, landing effectively, and really gave him a whooping. But the referee liked the aggressiveness of Marvin Hart and gave him the victory. So you had that type of stuff as well. So it's certainly craziness during the times as far as how some of those outcomes came about. Vinny66 says, very true. Mitchell was a smart man. When he got in trouble, he would drop the end around. Indeed, indeed. So, yeah, I'd imagine if you were to have polled Sullivan on what opponent he hated most, it likely would have been Charlie Mitchell. Now, he had a dislike for James Corbett as well, but I think it was more geared towards the fact that Corbett was this astute boxer who was coming up with confidence, and at that particular time was a legitimate challenge for John L. Sullivan, who was starting to gain a lot of traction and backing. But I think that, yeah, if you polled him at that particular time, certainly Charlie Mitchell, probably because of the fact that Mitchell was a smaller guy, and not only did he do the things that Vinny mentioned, but Mitchell was the first person to actually knock down John L. Sullivan in a matchup as well. This was actually, a gloved matchup when they fought. Can't remember the year, but basically Sullivan stormed out of the gate, and he actually was trying to knock out Mitchell, and he got caught with a wide shot from Mitchell that sit him down, and it was near the end of the round, as a matter of fact. So he was pissed and angered. Now he came out the next round and just started to pummel Charlie Mitchell, and then it went another round before it was ultimately called. I think he ended up knocking Mitchell out of the ring. He was so angry and just heated about the moment overall. But yeah, I think Charlie Mitchell was probably the fighter he disliked most in his. I think if you weighed his competition as a whole, that's who he would probably have chosen. Vinny66 also says the fact that Sullivan would make a challenge, I can lick any son of a bitch in the house, tells you all you need to know about Sullivan's belief in themselves and is the must for the great fighters. Indeed. Yeah, don't get me wrong. Sullivan, hey, he was one tough cookie, and he he was a prominent figure in a time when boxing didn't necessarily have that marquee superstar. Of course, it was taking place globally, but you didn't have that one star that was a guy who you could latch on and really view as the best in the world, the best period. And Sullivan worked his way into becoming that person. As a matter of fact, it kind of ran parallel with that of nonpareil Jack Dempsey, who fought in a similar time as John L. Sullivan. Now, nonpareil Jack Dempsey was the original Jack Dempsey, of course, for those who may be familiar with the other heavyweight. But nonpareil Jack Dempsey was the middleweight champion of the world, and nonpareil essentially it means unrivaled. There are many who felt that he couldn't be defeated, and he too was on a very high trajectory as far as popularity is concerned around the same time as John L. Sullivan, as they were working their way upwards in the ranks and starting to really make major noise in the sport. So some would argue that it was pretty much 1A, 1B, or 1 and 2, essentially. Sullivan being the guy, but nonpareil Jack Dempsey not that far behind as far as this popularity and the amount of backing that he had as a fighter as well. So certainly, Sullivan, he was one hell of a competitor, and he issued this open challenge across the country to take on anyone pretty much in a four round fight. If you can knock him off of his feet or do whatever, last the distance, then you would be the man. But no one could actually take up that challenge and get the victory. Bosman says Sullivan had the attitude of a tough guy, and he was one. While the guy he lost the title to was known as Gentleman Jim. Yes, certainly. Yeah, Jim wasn't necessarily known to be a tough guy, but actually, Gentleman Jim, he had one of the toughest resumes in boxing. Big contrasted image, very much so. Sullivan was rugged. Eventually, Sullivan, he got to the point where he was basically just a step above outlaw as far as his reputation was concerned with his out of the ring antics, especially when he would get on some of his drunken benders. He had issues. He had run-ins with the law. He would strike certain people. You think about that today, a boxer actually striking a civilian and the implications of such. But Sullivan, he was doing that type of stuff. He would get into situations. He had a temper, and you saw the bad side of it play out at times. But that being said, he was considered to be the man's man during that time, and I think that added to the bravado a bit more. By contrast, of course, Gentleman Jim, he was a scholarly type guy, and he wasn't a big guy. We've seen videos and pictures of him. He really studied boxing. He spent time in the amateurs. Of course, he's from San Francisco, built his name there. San Francisco actually had a lot of top boxers, a lot of great competition come out of that area. So you had competition as you were working your way up. Joe Chewinski, also from San Francisco. But if you look at it, resume for resume, Sullivan had more fights and all of that. But Jim Corbett, Gentleman Jim, he had a very tough resume. If you look at who he actually fought, I think he was like 11-4-3. So in totality, he had maybe 20 fights or just around 20 fights. It was either just under or a little bit above. And Gentleman Jim, man, he was just a very clever scientific boxer, and he learned from great boxers, great trainers who brought that scientific style to the sport as well. And that's a misconception, of course, that boxing science started with Jim Corbett, but that wasn't necessarily the case. You had some well before him. You think about guys like nonpareil Jack Dempsey, etc. Jim Corbett, he learned a lot from Professor Mike Donovan, who spent time as a bare knuckle fighter and a boxer, and who was considered a scientific boxer for his time. There's actually video out there of Professor Sullivan or Professor Donovan in older age. There's a fight of him taking on Billy Edwards, I believe, and he was a scientific boxer. He was actually in Sullivan's or in Corbett's corner. He was in his corner during the John L. Sullivan fight, as a matter of fact, when Corbett was able to win the world heavyweight title. So, but Corbett, he was a very good fighter with a tough resume, and despite the Gentleman Jim namesake, he was scrappy enough of a fighter with skills that he could hang with the best of them during his particular time, and that's without a doubt. Dan L says John L. Sullivan was America's first superstar. His autobiography was, for a time, the second best-selling book in America after the Bible. Indeed, yes, that is very much true. The first superstar in the sport. If we think about what the world heavyweight title would become and what it meant, that all started with John L. Sullivan, especially when we got to the late 1800s, of course, leading into the 1900s, or the late 1880s, leading into the 1890s. That he was very much instrumental in boxing rising in popularity and the heavyweight champion becoming one of the premier titles just in the sport in general. And it's estimated that he might have been the most popular man on earth outside of and in the United States. Certainly, it was either him or the president of the United States, and some would argue it was John L. Sullivan. And then globally, yeah, John L. Sullivan, similar thing. He was able to build this mystique about him, and he really helped himself by doing things that were somewhat unconventional in terms of taking on these cross country tours, challenging anyone. He at one point, had his own play, which is something that you would see subsequent heavyweight champions start to participate in. Honest Hearts and something was the name of his play, but he had this play that went across country. Honest Hearts and Willing Hands, I think that's what the name of it is. Honest Hearts and Willing Hands is where he took his show to the road, and from all indications, he wasn't much of an actor, but it didn't matter. People wanted to see the world heavyweight champion, and there was a scene at the end where he would, of course, defeat the villain or knock out the whomever villain, or I think he was the protagonist or whatever. But essentially, yeah, he took this on a road, and he was able to build up a lot of fanfare with such, and that just helped to boost his popularity. And so he did write an autobiography at that particular time. Wish I had a copy of that. That would be pretty awesome. But yeah, no doubt about it. There weren't many, if any, who rivaled him in popularity in general. And I think that essentially speaks to the man he was, for sure. Hyphy, so he was a Liston type bad boy. Indeed, he was Hyphy. He was Sonny Liston. That's one who certainly had his run-ins outside of the boxing ring. So yeah, definitely Sullivan. He had his run-ins without a doubt. He had a Liston type rap sheet, I guess, if you look at quantity. Ultimately, when it all panned out. And this happened for Sullivan while he was at the top of his game, essentially. He worked his way to get to become the world heavyweight champion, but that didn't change him and his mindset in that sense, because, yeah, he certainly was a bad boy for that time. And could you only imagine if it was in the age of social media? I mean, he would be all over television. He wouldn't catch any slack. If you think about the world heavyweight champion having some of these issues where he assaulted people, any domestic violence type issues. So you name it, the full gamut there with Sullivan. He had his issues, especially when he would drink, and that seemed to be the big catalyst for it. And with that popularity and fame came more money. So he had his own bar at one point, and so he could go to any place or any bar, and essentially he didn't have to pay for drinks because he's the world heavyweight champion. He's John L. Sullivan, or John L. as he would become. And so he didn't have to pay for anything. It was pretty much there for the taking for him. So in the sense that it was a given. I mean, who's going to charge the world heavyweight champion? You're happy to have him there, and the fanfare and all of that comes along with it. So he was able to benefit from such, but certainly he could have he would have been better served having some individuals around him who could have better helped to manage, that sort of temper latent side of him that kind of threw him off at times, where he would get into some of these troubling situations for sure. Boz, man, that's what I was going to say. Corbett was the boxer while Sullivan was the fighter. Indeed, that certainly was the case. Sullivan was very much an offensive type of fighter, and so he usually, whenever a fight started, he was intent on gunning for the knockout, and I think that's what sort of helped him and pushed his popularity forward as well. Because prior to him, of course, knockouts are things that would happen, but to see a heavyweight who really came forward and looked to do this on a night in, night out basis, and he was all offense, pretty much a very much offensive based fighter, that helped to usher in his popularity as well. And if you think about the bare knuckle fighting, it was almost the antithesis of this, because in the world of bare knuckle, you could grab, hold, and throw down and all of that stuff. So oftentimes you weren't seeing knockouts in the sense that we think about them today, where you could get an early round knockout, which of course that could happen, but in all likelihood, you could be an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours in on a bare knuckle fight before the knockout actually comes, just given the way the rules were and all of that stuff. So the Marquess of Queensberry rules, blood fighting, kind of sped things up in that regard as well. And so that helped with the popularity and its eventual overcoming bare knuckle fighting to become the premier sort of fighting sport or combative sport in the world, essentially. With all the video game technology, I would love them to use holography to make sure, or holography to make sure some of the fights between the greats that never happened, using real life attributes of each fighter. Yeah, that would be pretty awesome. I guess the closest we have to that is the sort of video game stuff. You see people who've created them in like Fight Night Champion and other video games of that nature. You also have this new one out here that's Undisputed, is what the name of it is, where I think they don't have a create a character model yet, but yeah, that's the closest thing right now. I've thought about that. As a matter of fact, I've been looking into some stuff that could kind of bring that to the forefront in some sense, is more so geared towards artificial intelligence and the use of AI to sort of recreate certain things. Now, it isn't a straight up, I don't have all of the information on it, but I've seen some things that are out there that allow for you to be able to essentially recreate, reenact, and take samples and pictures of a particular fighter. You can basically get to the point where you almost have the fighter himself reconstructed. But it's certainly not something that I have the full knowledge and understanding of, and who knows if I ever will. But I've looked into some things where it almost be like a reenactment that would bring to life some of these old fighters, as well as the potential of bringing to life some of these old fights. Because for some of the stuff that was documented during those times, you have great play-by-play or round-by-round. There are fights that the reporters during the time, they did a great job of documenting everything as it went down on a round-by-round basis. And I think that sort of adds to the ability to recreate some of these and give it a real feel and look as though you're seeing what it was like during that particular time. But certainly varying things out there. We'll see how technology continues to come into the fold. It's pretty amazing where we've gotten so far because, yeah, you see, I've posted some things where you can basically take, of course, you can take the old photos, add movements and features to those. You can have someone actually talking. I posted a video of Gene Tunney, John L. Sullivan, and Jack Johnson, where they're actually talking, sharing quotes from them that they had stated. Of course, there's almost always more work to be done, and of course, getting the voices down, like, and not knowing what they sounded like. Essentially, that could come into the fold, but we know what some of them sounded like. But generally, you get what I'm saying. But yeah, I think that technology may offer the ability to do some of those things, Vinny. I think that would be pretty awesome. We had that Ali Marciano fight at one particular point, and that was almost something like new for its time, where it was computer generated in some sense, and they had to go through the process of reenacting it. But it would be pretty amazing to see something similar where it was all just done through AI or whatever it is, and it could reconstruct some of these fight scenes, etc. The thoughts of such is pretty appealing for sure. Shout out to Paul Bright. He says, "What's up, gents? Appreciate you coming in, Paul. Great to have you on. It was great chatting with you on Sunday as well. Great discussions. We were talking about a lot of the modern stuff that was going on. We are talking about John L. Sullivan here, Paul. Just the career of John L. Sullivan. I guess you can say life and career, but in general, just John L. Sullivan discussion, the first world heavyweight champion, or at least recognized world heavyweight champion in the sport of boxing. And Bosman sends his regards as well. But I think we left off essentially where we were talking about Sullivan. He, of course, defeated Patty Ryan. That wasn't the end all be all for him. And he had a feud with Richard Kyle Fox, who was the editor in chief, owner of the National Police Gazette. So the story is that they had some type of run in, I guess you can say, where Sullivan kind of shaded Richard Kyle Fox in some sense, and Richard Kyle Fox didn't like that. He didn't really, he kind of gaffed him off, didn't really pay attention to him, and treated him like he was second fiddle, I guess you can say. Something to that tune, to where Richard Kyle Fox grew a dislike for Sullivan. So uh, even though Sullivan, in I believe it was 1885, he won the American American heavyweight title. I believe it was 1885, where he defeated Dominic McCaffrey, and he's recognized as the American champion. And ultimately, many people viewed him as the best heavyweight at that particular time. But it wasn't the case with Richard Kyle Fox. And for Richard Kyle Fox, he made it very apparent that the world heavyweight champion, that claim, that actual title, had always been exchanged through bare knuckle fighting. And so, therefore, even though Sullivan beat Patty Ryan and he continued on his run, it wasn't enough. Certainly wasn't enough for Richard Kyle Fox. So the next person that was sought out, who was viewed as the person that Sullivan had to beat, was Jake Kilrain. And of course, Sullivan and Jake Kilrain fought in 1889. Now, Jake Kilrain, he's a guy, he's about 5'10", a little bit more leaner than Sullivan as far as his overall build. He was a leaner fighter. That being said, Kilrain, he came from the bare knuckle world. He actually had a pretty solid boxing career. I know it was 40 plus fights. It may have been around 50 fights or a little bit over, but certainly in that 40 plus fight club. And this was after his work as a bare knuckle fighter as well. Now, he had become the bare knuckle champion. I think he had an actual London Prize ring rules fight with Jim Smith. The year might have been around 1887, but this took place across the pond. It was somewhere in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember if it was England specifically, but Jake Kilrain had defeated Jim Smith at that particular time. And we have a video on both Kilrain and Jim Smith. Jim Smith, he was this solidly built guy. He spent the majority of his time in the bare knuckle world. Now, the majority of the videos that we have on the channel where we do the career video, they speak on their boxing career. So for guys like Jim Smith, Jake Kilrain, who just so happen to have a lot of boxing matches, but essentially him, guys like Professor Mike Donovan, Patty Ryan, etc., they didn't really have long boxing careers under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. So you'll see weird things like they may have like 12 boxing matches or whatever, and it looks skewed and thrown off. I think Patty Ryan, he didn't even have a winning record. I don't know if he won a boxing match actually, but the reason behind it is because this is just what was, I guess, officially under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. But they, as mentioned, had bare knuckle careers as well. So Kilrain beat Jim Smith in the bare knuckle world. Jim Smith, this tough guy. If you see a picture of Jim Smith, he's almost like a bodybuilder. I mean that. And he was just solidly built, stocky guy, had a huge neck and huge traps. And that proved beneficial for him in the bare knuckle world, though Jake Kilrain was able to solve it or solve the Jim Smith puzzle and everything. So he ended up defeating Jim Smith and was recognized as a world heavyweight champion in the bare knuckle world at the very least. And therefore, this was counter to John L. Sullivan's claim as being the best or the world heavyweight champion or the heavyweight champion in general. And so one thing led to another, and ultimately the National Police Gazette, they put their backing behind Jake Kilrain, Bosman. So this is who Jimmy Kilrain Kelly took that name from. That's some honorary name. It may have very well been the case right there, Boz. That may have very well been the case. I can't say with certainty, but that may have been the case for sure. But yeah, in addition to that, Kilrain, he also, if I'm not mistaken, I think he beat Charlie Mitchell as well, who is someone who had drew with Sullivan, as mentioned. And Sullivan, of course, had beaten Charlie Mitchell, but still, this is what allowed for Kilrain to become the name, the marquee guy. Now, so they fought in 1889, right? So if you look it up, and we've done some stuff on Sullivan, Kilrain, as mentioned, this is the most famous of the bare knuckle fights. We actually have pictures where you can see John L. Sullivan and Jake Kilrain in action. It's pretty much a sight to see, but the fight went down again in Mississippi, and Governor Lowry, who I had mentioned earlier, he really had it out for the two guys. They waited and kept it in secret for the entirety of the time up until the point of the fight because they knew that law enforcement would be on them. But essentially, the fight went down in Mississippi. Governor Lowry, he had law enforcement out and ready to stop anything, stop the trains from taking them to where this fight location would be, et cetera, et cetera. And he even sought law enforcement from outside of the state of Mississippi as well. It was a big deal to him, and he viewed Sullivan as lawless, reckless, and this is how he viewed the others as well, but particularly Sullivan, because Sullivan had already fought back in 1882 when he ended up fighting Patty Ryan for bare knuckle in Mississippi City as well. So you have to think that Lowry's been holding this in. Governor Lowry is holding this in this entire time. But essentially, when they get to the fight ended up being around 3 hours. It was the 70. As mentioned, I'm not looking at it. I want to say the 74th round. I think it was prior to the 75th round is when it's actually ended, and the Kilrain's corner actually threw in the sponge, and I believe in his corner actually Kilrain had Professor Mike Donovan, And if you recall, Professor Mike Donovan is someone who I mentioned was a scientific boxer who was a trainer as well. And he really pushed he was cutting edge in pushing the scientific movement forward as well. But he wasn't the only one. As mentioned, there were boxers during that time who possessed clever scientific skills. And Professor Mike Donovan just so happened to be in Jake Kilrain's corner at that time. So he essentially threw in the sponge there in, I think, what was the 74th round, because Kilrain was at a point where, yeah, it was viewed that he would actually die if he continued on. And Bosman says, so a sponge was used in. Interesting. Yes. Generally, a sponge, what they threw in, I just assume they probably had some towels back then that they had there as well. But yeah, they typically threw in the sponge or threw down that sponge to signify, okay, it's over, we're done. But essentially, Sullivan and Kilrain had battled it out for 74 rounds. Now, each of these rounds weren't all of the same length. There was a particularly long round in that fight. Can't remember which round it was, but it was one of those where it can be very uneven. If you think about that, 74 rounds, that's insane, right? But yeah, some of them could have been thrown down. And then actually, you can look at some of the pictures. You can see them tied up. You can see a punch being landed, and you can see Kilrain going down. There's actually pictures of Kilrain on the ground. I know I have some videos of it out there, but also it's just one of those things. The fight went that long because of the fact that, yeah, you had these varying things, and there might have been some points where Kilrain went down to save himself from some of the pain, especially on the back end. But ultimately, Sullivan beat Jake Kilrain in this fight. And in addition to having the backing, they each had a side bet, and that was about $10,000. So a lot of money was exchanged in that regard. So everything was going to the winner. And after the fight, they essentially had to hightail it, and both ultimately had warrants issued for their arrests. They were eventually arrested, and Sullivan had a ton of legal trouble in Mississippi tied to that specific fight as well. And he vowed after that particular fight that, hey, he would no longer be fighting bare knuckle, and that's why we never saw him fight bare knuckle again. But in addition to that, it was also the fact that he was really caught up in a lot of stuff on the outside of the ring as well. So after that fight, we didn't really see much of him at all, because he ended up fighting Corbett, as mentioned, in 1892. I think Kilrain was the last fight prior to that. And then he didn't fight again from there, even though there were points and times in which he had actually mentioned that he was going to try and make a comeback. And he had a disdain for Corbett, of course, and he wanted to come back against Corbett, but it just never happened because he can never be whipped into the shape that he was in for his fight with Jake Kilrain or prior to that. And he was trained by William Muldoon, who was just wrestler from back in the day, a Greco-Roman wrestler. And William Muldoon became head of the Madison Square Garden, so he put on a lot of great fights at Madison Square as well, which is one of those little nuggets. So he's in the Sullivan photo. And in one of the Sullivan videos we did, how John L. Sullivan changed boxing. Yeah, we highlight William Muldoon in there as well. But yeah, it's pretty crazy that he ended up becoming the New York State or Madison Square Garden, I don't know if you call it chairman or something, the person in charge there. And we know what New York and the Madison Square Garden means for boxing in general. Danielle says Corbett knocked out Charlie Mitchell in the third round decision, Jake Kilrain in sixth. Indeed, good stuff there, Dan. Yeah. So Corbett, as mentioned, tough resume, tough schedule. He fought all of the top guys. As a matter of fact, John L. Sullivan, two fighters that they wanted him to fight. Well, three, I think, early on. There was this black fighter who's considered the first colored world heavyweight champion. His name's C.C. Smith. We have a video on him. Charles A.C. Smith, but commonly known as C.C. Smith. And he was considered the first colored world heavyweight champion. There was a point in time where the two were potentially going to fight, but it didn't happen, or at least it was brought up. I think CC Smith was at an event where Sullivan had one of those open challenges, but it ended up not happening. Then there was also George Godfrey, who was another fighter who became the color heavyweight champion, and of course the Black Prince Peter Jackson. Now Corbett, he fought both of these guys, if I'm not mistaken. I think he fought Godfrey and Jackson, but I'm drawing a blank on Godfrey. I feel like he fought him, but I know for sure he fought Peter Jackson, and they went actually 61 rounds. And the sort of notion was that the winner would take on John L. Sullivan for the world heavyweight title. Ultimately, we weren't going to get the Peter Jackson versus John L. Sullivan fight. It ended up being a draw after 61 rounds of fighting, and this wasn't under London prize ring or bare knuckle rules. This was under Marquess of Queensberry rules, so it was a grueling fight. And essentially, Sullivan or Corbett and Jackson duked it out, and Jackson was considered the other best heavyweight at the time. And Sullivan and Corbett ended up going on to meet Sullivan. And at that particular time, of course, Sullivan, like I said, he started to wane from his training and his focus, as a matter of fact. And I think that was ultimately his downfall. And one of the reasons he went out sort of hard, I guess you can say. He went out kind of how he came in, like a ball of thunder, I guess you can say. Vinny 66, after Fox refused to give Sullivan the belt defense, Sullivan had a belt made for him with gold and jewels that read Champion of Champions. Indeed, yes, that was the case. So, yeah, fans actually had a belt made for Sullivan, which is, what greater homage could you pay right there? Now, that was ultimately, I think it was either, I think he sold it, auctioned it off, or something happened with it. But I know it no longer was in his possession, of course, at the time of death and all that stuff, because he went through some financial issues there at the end. But a lot of that was due to the fact that he kind of spiraled out of control with his drinking. Excuse me. And, that was the kind of story of the back end of his career. Now, by the time that he actually died, he had, he had settled down, and he was, he had a sort of fixed income, I guess you can say, but he wasn't wealthy, but he had enough that he was able to live comfortably there at the tail end. But it was estimated he had made over $1 million during his fight career. Now, if you think about that, that is actually an insane amount. I don't even know what it would calculate to today with inflation, but to put it in perspective, I think Jack Dempsey, when he fought George Carpentier in 1921, his purse was like around $300,000 and something, and that equivalent today was like $4 million and some change, somewhere in there, 4 million. So 1921, so 300 and something thousand in 1921 is the equivalent of 4 million and something today. So if you think about Sullivan, when he ended his career in 1892 and having made estimated like $1 million in his fight career, that's a staggering amount of funding that he would have come across, and subsequently lost the majority of it for varying reasons, much like a number of athletes, and not even just boxers, but athletes in general. We've heard the stories, of course, where they've lost a ton of stuff, and then they ended up losing some of the trinkets and things they had from their time when they were at their best, when they were champions. This belt being one of them, which would have been certainly cool to have around here today. If I recall correctly, I can't remember. I feel like I read somewhere that it was ultimately broken down and melted down or something of that nature. So the belt in itself once it was out of his possession, it didn't even remain as it was. I think it was melted down for the gold and whatever that was tied to it, which is, of course, sad, but it's an all too familiar story. Uh, anyway, of course, I haven't touched on every single thing. Certainly, we'll have to wrap it up, but I will say that, of course, I just wanted to touch on John O'Sullivan, and of course, that 1892 loss to Jim Corbett was his final fight of his career. Now, it's unfortunate because we don't have any video of John L. Sullivan outside of when he was older, and he was caught in some videos with, or during the time that John L. Sullivan or James Jeffrey was going to take on Jack Johnson, who was the world heavyweight champion at the time. So during that particular time, we have some video of John L. Sullivan where he's actually like he's sparring with James Corbett, and then of course he's swinging at a heavy bag or punt, not a heavy bag, but a speed bag. Now you don't see much from it, of course. And John L. Sullivan at that particular time looked a lot older than what he actually was. I think he died at 64. But that being said, this was after he really didn't take care of himself once his fighting career was over in that sense, in the physical sense. So he didn't look like the fighter he was. Of course, a lot of people change over their age, but he had a lot of issues outside of the ring, of course, with the drinking and all of that stuff. So he ended up, of course, not really taking care of himself the way he should have. And therefore, that's why at 32 years of age is when he had his final fight, which is not uncommon in the older days for guys who had a ton of fights in general, which we know provides for a lot of wear and tear. But in the case of Sullivan, of course, and it's estimated he had probably around 500 fights. And this is taking into account those that were considered like exhibitions, those where he was doing these 4-rounders and such. But still, there was probably more left in the tank that went by the wayside that we never got to see because of the fact that Sullivan had so many issues outside of the ring. And if you think about the first film, the first boxing film, or at least the one that we're most common and accustomed to seeing where there's a professional boxer involved, was when it was Jim Corbett taking on, I believe it was Chester Leone. So that video was shot on Thomas Edison's, I want to say Black Pariahs, maybe what it was called. But essentially, at that particular time, if my memory serves me correctly, that was potentially going to be John L. Sullivan. I think that was 1886 or 1887, I believe. That was gonna, or 1896 or 7. I think it was 1897, somewhere in there. Not the 80s, but the 90s, 1890s. But it ended up being Corbett versus Leon, but I believe it was offered to John L. Sullivan first, who turned it down because he didn't like the amount of money that was offered. And I think it would have paid for itself multiple times over had he actually taken up on the opportunity and the potential for what could have come in the aftermath of it. But that's why we do have video of Corbett, who second world heavyweight champion, just so happened to be at the right time, but that could have been John L. Sullivan. We could have had more of him because even at that particular time, Sullivan would have been in his late 30s. It's just that he had our mid to late 30s, actually, depending on when some of the filming could have potentially happened. But because of the way things ended, we never did actually get to see him at his peak outside of some pictures. Now, it's pretty cool that we do have the pictures and not even at his peak, but just in general prior to the older age of John L. Sullivan. But we do have pictures of him when he was in his fighting form and he was formidable, all of that stuff. But he wasn't that far off from us being able to have actual video of him in action. And right now we don't, so people can only make a judgment of what it was or what he may have looked like. He was considered to be an offensive fighter, a brawler in some regards. I think he had a bit of science to him, probably not to the degree that you would associate with some of the more astute boxers, but he was well aware of feinting, that type of stuff. So I'd imagine, it probably didn't look as pretty as some of the more technical fighters. But that being said, I do believe that he did have some ability to him. And he may have very well been a brawler in the sense of the word, but that's not to say that he didn't have some technique to him. Because he did train, of course. He got better as time went on. But that being said, of course, we don't have that sort of visual reference of him to really tie back to, which we do have with the likes of Corbett and a host of other great fighters. Vinny66 says, when Peter Jackson fought Corbett, he was already in the beginning phase of tuberculosis. I'm not diminishing Corbett's performance, but I wonder what would have happened with Jackson at his best. Hey, agree there. That's a great point right there, Vinny. Yeah, tuberculosis was one of those, I guess you can say, silent or loud killers during that time for many people. And there were a number of great boxers who went out by virtue of tuberculosis. And I was actually going to do something on that. I have this little script I had written up, as a matter of fact, talking on some of the boxers who essentially died of tuberculosis. And we know, like Joe Gans, he's one of them, Peter Jackson, freaking Nonpareil Jack Dempsey. We don't have any video of Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, and he is another one of those fighters during that time who potentially would have had video. So Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, he died at 32 years of age. It was in the 1890s as well. I can't remember exactly year, but he wasn't far off from video, and tuberculosis took him out. So we don't have any video of Nonpareil Jack Dempsey. It would have certainly been awesome to have had some. And I think had not it been for his untimely death, we would have gotten that. And so he's another like Peter Jackson, who there at the tail end of his career when he was fighting, he had already dealt with multiple bouts of tuberculosis. So for Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, you think he was able to do what he was able to do by the age of 32 and having already overcome bouts with tuberculosis before ultimately he succumbed to it. That speaks a lot to just the toughness of the fighters of that type. And as mentioned, same with the likes of Joe Gans, who also there at the tail end of his career, in which, of course, was cut short for all of these guys, essentially cut short in some sense because of tuberculosis, something we don't necessarily have to deal with today because the situation has changed. But certainly back then, one of those things. No problem, Benny. Appreciate it. Salute, Boz, man. Of course, Dan L. Corbett fought Peter Courtney in 1894 for Thomas Edison. Dan L. pointed it out right there. I said Chester Leon. Chester Leon fought Little George Dixon, as a matter of fact. I'm pretty sure, as a matter of fact. No, but it's Peter Courtney. So he's right. So 1894. Think about that. So Danielle says Corbett fought Peter Courtney in 1894 for Thomas Edison. Courtney claimed to be the heavyweight champion of New Jersey. You can see that Corbett is just fooling around and going easy on Courtney. Yes, indeed. But if you think about that, 1894, so it's actually a little bit before what I had actually thought. So John L. Sullivan's last fight was in 1892 when he lost to Jim Corbett. So that's why I was saying he could have been that person that was in that 1894 video, but he turned it down over the financial aspect. And I'm sure in hindsight, he probably looked back and thought to himself, like, damn, I should have taken that, but hey, at that particular time, you really couldn't tell him much because he's, John L. Sullivan. I mean, superstar of the sport, essentially. But for those that haven't seen it, which I'm guessing majority of who are on here probably have seen it, but you can check out Corbett versus Peter Courtney. Is like funny. It's like one of the earliest videos of boxing, or certainly of pro. I think they have some stuff of like some boxing catch from that time. And then these two other guys messing around, and then they have these two sisters messing around on some boxing film from around that time. But this right here could have been John L. Sullivan, but unfortunately we didn't get to see it. That being said, we do have some video of him in older age, as mentioned. That stuff is out there on YouTube for sure. Then Vinny says, Peerless Jim Driscoll also died of tuberculosis. Yep, that is true. He died. I know he wasn't, I think he had finished fighting, right? But he wasn't that old, as a matter of fact. Wasn't that old, and tuberculosis took him out. So I think he's someone that I had on the list. And there was another fighter from, I want to say late 1800s, who suffered a similar fate. And I think with him, it was in the middle of his career, or something of that nature, similar to some of the others. But yeah, TB was that was something else right there. That was something else without a doubt. Dan, great show. Thank you, Dan, and all who attended. And it was great to actually have the discussion. I know it was really kind of high level in some sense. It's hard to narrow down the career of any fighter in an hour, except maybe Pete Rudemaker, because he only had that one fight. But that being said, of course, with John L. Sullivan, the legend, the stories, and all of that stuff, it's insane. So this really isn't everything. As mentioned, we have some videos of him, of John L. Sullivan. I actually have a John L. Sullivan playlist speaking on different things. But despite John L. Sullivan, his faults and all that stuff in terms of one of the characters in boxing, man, a movie needs to be made. I'm sure something has been made that isn't really mainstream. I could be wrong, but I imagine something that isn't mainstream of that popular ilk. But that being said, he has so many crazy stories that he is certainly worthy of a movie, long overdue at this particular point. And you think about where we are now, what could potentially be done. So let's see if we can get something like that happening. Heck, you know what? If we can't get it, maybe I have to do it myself. But we'll see how that goes. But no, it's all good. Paul Bright says, adios, amigos. Appreciate you, Paul Bright. Hypey, enjoy hearing the story. Appreciate you, Hypey. No doubt about it. Hey, appreciate having you all here, without a doubt. Hey, we're going to do more. Talk about some boxing history. Because, hey, I love talking about the history. Boz and I, we talk on Sundays. We sometimes dive into the history, but certainly more crazy stories out there and crazy careers of some of these fighters from back in the day who were just fighting in different times, different conditions. Those were tough guys back then. And it's not very close in terms of some of the stuff they had to deal with back then by comparison to us and fighters of today. It's just really no comparison, because they were dealing with some real issues that were crazy at that particular time as it relates to the conditions of competing in a sport that was in its infancy, in some sense, in its infancy. But definitely, Bosman said, this is very interesting. Thank you, John. So thank you. Certainly appreciate everyone who dropped in. And Danielle says, Gentleman Jim with Errol Flynn as Corbett and Ward Vaughn and Sullivan was great. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I have heard of that one. Need to check that out without a doubt. But yeah, more to come without a doubt. We're going to have more of these discussions that center on the history, because as we all know, we love the history of the sport. If you follow this channel, then certainly you love history. More to come without a doubt. So cheers and salute to you all. Have a good night.